On the afternoon of October 12, 1997, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 lay upside down in a ploughed field east of the M11 motorway near Duxford. Its narrow landing gear had sunk into the earth, the propeller had struck the ground, the rear fuselage and tail were badly damaged. Inside the cockpit, the pilot was still trapped. The canopy had been pressed against the soil and could not be opened. Fuel was leaking around him, but there was no fire. The rescue crew considered cutting through the canopy or fuselage. The pilot asked them not to. Instead, he wanted them to lift the aircraft, both to avoid further structural damage and to reduce the danger of cutting around the trapped cockpit. The machine lying inverted before them was more than an aircraft that had just crashed. It was a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G2 Trop, Werknummer 10,639. It was better known as Black 6. It had survived combat, abandonment, capture by the enemy, wartime testing, decades of storage, and almost 20 years of restoration. The flight that afternoon had been intended to be its last before retirement to a museum. A crane was brought into the field. The rescue team raised the aircraft far enough to free the pilot. He emerged without injury. Black 6 had been recovered from the field, but this time it would never fly again. The story of the aircraft had begun 55 years earlier at the Erla factory in Leipzig. In September 1942, Werknummer 10,639 was completed as a Bf 109 G2 Trop. It belonged to the Gustav generation of the Messerschmitt fighter and was powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine. The Trop designation indicated equipment intended for operations in hot and dusty conditions, particularly those found in North Africa. The Luftwaffe accepted the aircraft in October. It was sent to Munich, then moved through northern Italy. At Bari, its factory markings were removed and the tactical number Black 6 was painted onto its fuselage. The aircraft continued through Athens and reached Cyrenaica in Libya, where it joined the third group of Jagdgeschwader 77. Black 6 arrived in North Africa as the Battle of El Alamein entered its final phase. Within days, Axis forces began retreating westward. Airfields, fuel stores, and maintenance facilities had to move with them. Under those conditions, an aircraft requiring major repairs could become a burden almost overnight. On November 4th, Black 6 was damaged during an aerial engagement. Heinz Ludemann, who probably flew the aircraft during this period, was slightly wounded but managed to bring it back. The fighter had not been destroyed, but it required repairs. An unidentified pilot later transferred it to Gambit Main Airfield, southeast of Tobruk. While the aircraft waited for maintenance, the front continued to move. German forces withdrew from Gambit. Unit records listed Black 6 as lost to enemy action on November 11th. There is no reliable account of the moment when German personnel left the aircraft behind. It is not known whether they intended to return for it. What is certain is that they did not completely destroy it. 2 days later, Flight Lieutenant Ken McRae, an engineering officer with No. 3 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, found Black 6 at Gambit, Maine. It was no longer ready for combat. The tailwheel and horizontal tail surfaces were damaged. The cockpit was incomplete. One propeller blade required repair. The radio, oxygen equipment, and several instruments were missing or unusable. Some of its armament and sighting equipment had also been removed or was unserviceable. But Black 6 was not beyond recovery. Its main structure remained sufficiently intact to be repaired. Around Gambit were other Bf 109s that had suffered much greater damage. Australian technicians removed a replacement tailplane, tailwheel, and other useful components from those aircraft. They fitted another canopy and carried out a temporary repair to the damaged propeller blade. On the fuselage, they painted the code CVV associated with squadron leader Bobby Gibbs. On November 15th, Gibbs flew Black 6 out of Gambit, escorted by 2 Kitty Hawks. Its journey through Allied airfields was not entirely trouble-free. During a long crosswind taxi behind a guiding vehicle, the brakes overheated and caught fire. The aircraft was repaired again and continued onward. Gibbs wanted it sent to Australia. For Allied technical intelligence, however, Black 6 was worth more as a working aircraft than as a captured trophy. The Gustav was still a relatively new version of the Bf 109. A complete example that could actually fly allowed engineers and test pilots to learn things that could not be discovered by measuring a damaged airframe on the ground. They could assess its speed, climb, handling, cooling system, and behavior in simulated combat against Allied fighters. Black 6 was transferred to testing units in Egypt and Palestine. It completed evaluation flights and took part in a simulated engagement against a Spitfire Mark 5C. After flying the aircraft, Bobby Gibbs described the 109 in his diary as an extremely good fighter with impressive performance. It was the judgment of a combat pilot who had just flown the enemy's machine. After its Middle Eastern trials, Black 6 was dismantled, packed into crates, and shipped to Britain. Before it arrived, the Royal Air Force allotted it the serial number RN-228. The aircraft was reassembled and assigned to number 1426 Enemy Aircraft Flight. The unit operated captured German and Italian aircraft so that Allied pilots, gunners, and air defense personnel could study them at close range, recognize them in the air, and better understand their capabilities. During 1944, Black 6 was flown in comparison with several Allied fighters, including the Tempest, Mustang, Spitfire, Corsair, Seafire, and Hellcat. It also appeared in demonstrations at British and American bases. The aircraft had changed owners, markings, and purpose, but it continued to fly. As the war in Europe approached its end, the need to operate captured enemy aircraft declined rapidly. The evaluation unit was disbanded early in 1945. RN-228 was transferred to Tangmere and later passed through several storage locations. In 1946, it was selected for preservation. That decision saved Black 6 from the fate of many captured aircraft, which were dismantled once their military value had disappeared. But preservation did not mean continuous care. Over the following years, the aircraft was moved repeatedly. At times, it was displayed outdoors. Early records already noted corrosion and deterioration of its surface finish. Components were removed, replaced, or lost. The history of its wartime repairs remained incomplete. In 1962, a team of volunteers at RAF Wattisham began dismantling Black 6 with the intention of returning it to flying condition. The wings, fuselage, and major assemblies were separated. Some original instruments were removed because the project planned to replace them with British equipment. Taking an old aircraft apart was the easier task. The real difficulty was proving that it could safely withstand the loads of flight. Black 6 had been damaged in combat, repaired with components taken from other aircraft, subjected to wartime trials, and stored for many years. No complete record existed of everything its structure had experienced. Costs increased. The amount of work became overwhelming. Concerns remained about hidden damage and the condition of the airframe. The project stopped before the aircraft could fly. Black 6 survived, but it was left dismantled and incomplete. The first post-war attempt to return it to the air had failed. 10 years later, another group began again. In September 1972, Black 6 was moved to RAF Lynham. Flight Lieutenant Russ Snadden led a new restoration project, this time supported by a longer commitment and assistance from several organizations. The work followed the aircraft through different bases, from Lynham to Northolt and then to Benson. Volunteers repaired structural sections, systems, and control surfaces. Suitable instruments and components were obtained from museums, foreign air forces, and private collectors across Europe. Restoring an aircraft for display is largely about recovering its appearance. Restoring one for flight demands much more. The landing gear must operate under real loads, the controls must move correctly, the fuel, oil, and cooling systems must function reliably. Components that appear intact must still be inspected for cracks, corrosion, and damage concealed beneath the surface. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine was overhauled by Rolls-Royce in Bristol. In 1987, it was installed in the aircraft again. On July 8, 1990, the engine of Black 6 ran once more. Several months later, the aircraft received the civilian registration GUSTV. On March 17, 1991, after almost 20 years of restoration, Black 6 was taken onto the runway at RAF Benson. Group Captain Reg Hallam sat in the cockpit. The BF-109 accelerated, lifted away from the ground and completed a flight lasting 32 minutes. Almost half a century after it had been abandoned at Gambut, Werknummer 10639 was flying again behind a DB605 engine. After further testing, the aircraft received permission to fly at public displays. For spectators, Black 6 offered something a static exhibit could not reproduce. They could hear the engine. They could watch the narrow landing gear retract into the wings. They could see the shape of the fighter moving through the air for which it had been designed. But the intention was never to keep it flying indefinitely. The original plan allowed Black 6 to perform for 3 years before entering a museum. That period was later extended to 5. Across roughly 3.5 display seasons, the aircraft accumulated about 96 hours in the air. By the autumn of 1997, the extension was approaching its end. The appearance at Duxford on October 12th was intended to be the last planned flight of Black 6 before retirement. The pilot that day was Air Chief Marshal Sir John Allison. He had more than 4,600 hours of flying experience, including 18 hours on the BF-109 type. Black 6 took off as part of the Duxford Autumn Airshow. It first flew in formation with a Spitfire, then began a solo display. Near the end of the performance, observers on the ground noticed something unusual. An airfield information officer called Allison by radio and reported white vapor trailing from the rear of the aircraft. As Black 6 passed through an inverted maneuver, Allison saw blue mist inside the cockpit. He smelled hot oil. The propeller pitch indicator began to fluctuate. From inside the aircraft, he could not know exactly what was happening. The signs could indicate an oil leak, an overheating engine, an impending seizure, or the beginning of a fire. If the engine failed completely, every second spent continuing the display would carry the aircraft farther from a safe landing area. Allison reduced power and immediately turned into a short approach for the grass runway 06. That decision limited his exposure to a possible engine failure. It also left almost no time to prepare the aircraft for landing. The BF-109 could not move instantly from a high-speed display configuration into a stable landing configuration. The flaps were lowered by a hand-operated wheel and required about 22 seconds to travel fully down. The landing gear required around 23 seconds and could take longer while the aircraft was still moving quickly. Allison wanted to maintain at least 200 kilometers per hour. If the engine seized, that speed would preserve elevator authority and kinetic energy for the final approach and flare. But the same energy would have to be dissipated on an 890-meter grass runway. Black 6 turned onto the final approach, high and fast. Video analysis suggested that it was still traveling at approximately 250 kilometers per hour after lining up with the runway. The normal reference speed over the threshold was closer to 175. Its flaps were at 30 degrees, short of the full 40-degree landing setting. The aircraft descended beyond the beginning of the runway and continued floating forward. Its wheels first touched the grass close to the middle of the available landing distance. Allison estimated that it was still moving at around 220 kilometers per hour. The landing gear touched the ground, and the aircraft bounced back into the air. Black 6 came down again, but it was still traveling too quickly. Too little runway remained. Heavy braking was not a safe solution. The BF-109 had a narrow landing gear. As the weight shifted forward during deceleration, aggressive braking could pitch the aircraft onto its nose. But continuing along the ground would almost certainly carry it beyond the end of the runway at considerable speed. Allison did not attempt a power go-around. Instead, He used the aircraft's remaining speed to lift clear of the runway end and the motorway embankment beyond it. Black 6 left the ground for the final time. It crossed the boundary of the airfield, passed over the M11 motorway, and headed towards the fields to the east. There was no prepared runway ahead. Once clear of the motorway, Allison switched off the magnetos and committed to the field in front of him. He brought the aircraft down with the landing gear still extended. At first, Black 6 rolled across an unprepared grassy area. It remained upright and its speed began to decrease. Then it entered ploughed ground. The narrow wheels sank into the soft earth. Resistance increased suddenly. The nose dropped. The propeller blades struck the soil, and Black 6 overturned. The aircraft came to rest upside down. The accident occurred at relatively low speed, but the forces still caused serious damage to the propeller, vertical tail, rudder, and rear fuselage. The wings and horizontal tail surfaces escaped the same degree of destruction. Allison was not injured, but the canopy was pressed against the ground and could not be opened. Fuel began leaking around the cockpit. Fire crews reached the field. Rather than cut immediately into the canopy or fuselage, they brought in a crane. Black 6 was raised far enough for Allison to escape. There was no fire. The pilot was recovered safely. The aircraft was then removed from the field while it was still inverted. It was placed on a trailer and taken to a hangar at Duxford. 2 weeks later, the wings and horizontal tail were removed. Another crane was used to turn the fuselage back into its normal position. Once Black 6 was upright, the investigation could begin. Engineers examined the engine, oil system, water pump, and the mechanism controlling the radiator flaps. They found no firm evidence that a major oil loss had occurred before the accident. There was no clear indication that the water pump had failed. The engine could still be turned and showed no obvious mechanical seizure capable of explaining the entire sequence. Analysis of the display footage suggested that the white trail was probably coolant vapor released as the engine overheated. The Bf 109 used adjustable flaps to control airflow through the radiators beneath its wings. When the engine was producing high power, those flaps needed to open far enough to provide additional cooling. During much of the display, they appeared to remain nearly closed. Investigators considered the possibility that the radiator flap selector had been positioned close to the automatic setting without fully entering its retaining notch. Tests showed that even a small misalignment could restrict hydraulic flow to the actuating system and prevent the radiator flaps from opening sufficiently. It was a plausible explanation, but it could not be proved. The position of the selector after the accident did not establish where it had been throughout the flight. It might have moved when the aircraft overturned or during the rescue operation. The overheating theory also failed to explain completely the blue mist and the smell of hot oil reported by Allison. The investigation did not end with a single failed component. What could be said with confidence was that Black 6 developed abnormal indications during its display. The white trail was probably coolant vapor. Believing that the engine might be developing a more serious problem, Allison decided to land immediately. The short approach brought the aircraft to the runway too high and too fast. Its first touchdown occurred with almost half of the available landing distance already behind it. From that moment, every remaining choice carried substantial risk. After the accident, Black 6 remained at Duxford while its future was considered. It could be repaired, but repairing an aircraft for display and repairing it to fly were two entirely different decisions. The machine had already passed through 55 years of combat, repair, testing, dismantling, and restoration. The accident had seriously damaged the rear fuselage and tail. The precise cause of the abnormal indications that forced the landing had also not been conclusively identified. In 1998, the decision was announced. Black 6 would be restored, but it would not return to flying condition. Some of the volunteers who had previously returned it to the air became involved once again. The damaged rear fuselage was repaired. A replacement vertical tail was installed. The propeller and other distorted areas were restored so that the aircraft could appear complete again. The Royal Air Force Museum estimates that the restored Black 6 contains approximately 70% original material. That figure does not mean the aircraft remained untouched. Its wings and fuselage contain components from several periods in its history, including parts taken from other Bf 109s in North Africa. But its identity remained continuous. Vac Numa 10,639 was still the aircraft that had left the Airla factory in 1942, been abandoned at Gambut, repaired by Australians, tested by the Royal Air Force, and returned to the sky by volunteers almost half a century later. Its civilian registration was cancelled in September 1998. In 2002, Black 6 was moved to the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon. In 2016, it was transferred to Duxford and placed on display. Inside the museum, Black 6 once again has the shape of a complete Bf 109. Its nose points forward, its vertical tail stands upright. There is little visible evidence of the moment when it lay inverted in a ploughed field near Duxford. But the accident in 1997 created a boundary that cannot be seen. Black 6 had been saved from an abandoned airfield during a retreat. It had been saved from decades of storage. It had survived an unsuccessful restoration and returned to the sky after almost 20 years of work. The final time, it was saved from a field by a crane. The pilot walked away safely. The aircraft was brought back as well. But only one of them would ever fly again.